This is lecture 6.3 for Psych 440, Multisource Feedback. And in this lecture, we're going to define what multisource feedback is, talk a little bit about why it's so very popular in organizations, and also about some of the disadvantages associated with it, and conclude with when we should and should not use multisource feedback. So as you might be able to guess, multi-source feedback, or 360-degree feedback as it's sometimes called, is designed in this idea that we can get the best of all possible worlds by combining input from all of those possible rating sources. So the 360-degree idea comes from the idea that you're getting ratings from above, from the supervisor, from subordinates below, from peers and customers, and from the employee themselves. You're getting all possible angles on the employee's performance. This idea became very popular with lots and lots of organizations based on three major assumptions. The first of these assumptions was that participants would like it better, that they would be happier with this than with traditional appraisal because they get a say. They get to rate themselves. They also get to participate by evaluating their peers and their supervisors. They're very, very deeply involved in the process, so they should have more positive reactions. Another assumption made about multi-source feedback is that because we've got so many people giving input into this process, any one rater's particular biases or idiosyncratic perspective is going to be canceled out by other people. So in the end, we should be left with ratings that are more accurate, more valid. We've gotten rid of some of that contamination by canceling it out. And then finally, the third assumption made about multi-source feedback is that including all of these different perspectives should give us a more complete, more realistic view of performance than any one source who only sees certain aspects of performance. So from an organizational perspective, these things sound really great. We should get more accurate appraisals, we should get a more complete view of performance, and we should have our employees be happier with the process. However, there's been quite a bit of research done on multi-source feedback that suggests that when it's used as an appraisal tool, it doesn't necessarily fulfill any of those assumptions. Participants aren't necessarily happier. Most people have concerns about their anonymity or their confidentiality in making these ratings. There can be a lot of distrust from employees about participating in this system. Well, my boss is going to know that it was me who said this. Or if I really tell you what I think about my coworker, it's going to come back. She's going to find out that it was me who said those unkind things, or those critical things, or those low ratings. On the flip side of it, particularly when there is this distrust, it's very, very easy for the people being rated to discount the feedback that they receive. If they receive critical ratings, they may say, well, I know that came from so-and-so in such and such department, and she just doesn't like me, so that's not really me. I don't have to change my behavior based on that. So there can be a lot of interpersonal issues, a lot of mistrust, a lot of dissatisfaction with a multi-source feedback process. That second assumption, that ratings will be better, that one is also rather lacking in support. Because there are so many people involved in the process, it's hard to train them all well. Most 360-degree feedback interventions don't provide a lot of training for peer and subordinate raters in how to use the system, so we have a lot of differing perspectives on what they're supposed to do. People also have conflicting motives. If someone is your friend, you don't want to rate them poorly. On the other hand, if you think, well, only one of the 10 of us is going to get promoted, I better make sure everybody else's ratings are lower than mine. And that can lead to a lot of difficulty, a lot of error, a lot of contamination in our ratings. We also tend to see, on the whole, fairly low levels of agreement between different sources. In the last lecture, we talked about how peer ratings and supervisor ratings and subordinate ratings were all moderately well correlated. That's in a relative sense. They're all correlated with each other better than you'd expect by chance, better than they are with self-ratings, but in terms of overall absolute levels of agreement, they're not as high as we would like to see if, say, we were doing observational research. They wouldn't meet our standards for what good agreement really looks like. On the flip side, that does kind of support assumption number 3, that including all these different raters gives you different perspectives, but that shows up in more noise, more mess, and more error in the overall ratings. I've got a quote for you. This is a quote that was passed on by a researcher named Bill Byam, who was one of the people who first created 360-degree feedback interventions. He reports this quote from a very famous CEO, Jack Welch, who was the former head of GE. His perspective on multi-source feedback. Said, "We loved that idea. For the first few years, it helped us locate the horses' asses who kissed up and kicked down." In other words, it didn't really help identify the good performers. It helped identify the people who were willing to rate their supervisors really highly and their peers really low. People who tended to use the appraisal system for their own political purposes. It says, like anything driven by peer input, the system is capable of being gamed over the long haul. People began saying nice things about one another so they all would come out with good ratings, and the 360s are now only used in special situations. So what they found at GE was that after people got used to the system and figured out how to work it in their favor, the ratings weren't worth very much at all. They weren't good indicators of performance. So, next question for you. When, if ever, is multi-source feedback or multi-source ratings effective? This is a situation where purpose matters very much. The first implementations of 360-degree feedback were meant for employee development, not for decision-making or administrative appraisal purposes, not as an overall assessment of a person's performance. When you use multi-source or 360-degree ratings for development, they can be very effective. When you tie promotions or raises or any kind of personnel decisions to them, that's when people tend to game the system. And we find this very broadly across different kinds of appraisal. When people know that an assessment is going to be tied to somebody's financial or career outcomes, their rating processes change. When they are confident, when they truly believe and trust that the purpose of an appraisal or an assessment is developmental, they're much more willing to be honest. But if they think there's even a chance that that information could be used somewhere down the line in personnel decisions, they're going to rate very leniently. We tend to be much more accurate when the purpose is development, much more generous when we think that other people's outcomes depend on it. So what we know about multi-source feedback is it can serve a purpose, but only within fairly limited circumstances. Multi-source feedback is only going to be effective in a positive organizational context. If you come into an organization that already has a climate of mistrust, where people don't feel like they consistently get the truth from upper management and from their supervisors, your multi-source feedback intervention is going to fail. You have to have that trust in place before people will make these ratings with any degree of honesty. You have to have a good, clear rating form. Now, it doesn't have to take any particular format, but it does need to be straightforward and easy to use. It's helpful to include definitions of things on there so that people can use it in a consistent manner. We also know that it's very important to have a quick turnaround. If it takes you 6 months to compile all of these multi-source ratings, by the time you give them back to people, they feel at least that their performance has already changed. Well, yeah, maybe that's how I was, but that doesn't relate to anything I've done lately. So timely, quick feedback is really important. Providing some degree of rater training is really, really helpful. Anything that you can do, whether it's a formal training session or good written instructions to try and get raters on the same page is going to improve the quality of your multi-source feedback ratings quite a bit. And throughout everything, multi-source feedback requires very, very good, very honest communication. If you are thinking about using your multi-source ratings for decision-making purposes, you need to be honest about that. If employees even suspect that that might happen, that you might say it's for development but change your mind later, they're going to rate as if it's for decision-making, not as if it's for development. So good, open, trustworthy, and trusted communication really does seem to be the key to good multi-source feedback. Now that we've talked about who should rate, answer being potentially anybody, we want to talk about how we can work with those raters to make good quality ratings. So we'll talk about quite a bit of research that's been conducted on errors people tend to make in ratings and what we can do about them.